Welcome, everyone. We're joined today by Dr. McCormick, a senior professor at Thompson Rivers University. Dr. McCormick is joining us today to present an Indigenous perspective on mental health and healing. Welcome, Dr. McCormick.
Always have to do that once. Forget to unmute. Don Shea, everyone. I'm calling you from the unceded territory of the Kamloops Secwepemc, and just want to acknowledge our host for this meeting, Kwanlin Dun First Nations, Tahnguetchin Council, and the government of the Yukon. Thank you for inviting me. So many of the presenters, well, first of all, to talk about Indigenous perspective is always risky because of generalization and the diversity amongst Indigenous peoples. But for the purpose of this presentation, I will do a little bit of generalizing just to show some differences with mainstream Western European thought and Indigenous thought. So a lot of the presenters today will talk about practical solutions such as public education, safer supply, etc. That's really important. Hopefully others will also discuss some of the practical obstacles to dealing with this sort of crisis, and the main one being retention and recruitment of mental health professionals in the communities. The mental wellness teams and the polyclinics and hubs and so on are always going to have this struggle with remote communities. But my brief presentation will look at sort of the bigger picture considerations, and Mike has agreed to show them for me. So let's go, Mike. Thank you. So I chose this title, "We Are Wired to Connect," and it has to do with the next slide. It was a quote. I think his name's Ryan North. I thought this is so true. Our brains are wired for connection, but trauma rewires them for protection. And I think COVID's really illustrated for all of those people that have experienced trauma in their lives, which is probably most Indigenous peoples, that this is tough. That disconnection is really tough. It's tough on all people, not just Indigenous. So I think that's part of our problem here, and hopefully COVID will be over soon. Knock on wood. Next slide. So this one, just a little bit of theory. For me, it helps me to think of connection in terms of Viktor Frankl's work. So he, for those that may or may not know him, he's a Jewish psychiatrist who survived the extermination camps in Nazi Germany. And he found that people and cultures can survive if they have a strong reason for living. I just lost my slide there. I can look at my submitted questions. Screen is blank. Okay. Are you guys seeing it yet? Okay, so I'll just continue then. So what as a means to eradicate Indigenous cultures, Canadian government moved to disconnect Indigenous peoples from these sources of meaning. And Frankl said that things like spirituality, work, significant relationships, contributing to your community, and that were sources of meaning for people. So next slide. Those that can't see it, it's a circle with the person in the middle, self, and then the outer circles are family, community, culture, and the natural and spiritual world. So these, as we transcend the self, these are our sources of meaning and strength. And so what happened, and we'll go to the next slide, is we were disconnected from these sources of meaning overtly and systematically. So family disconnection, of course, we had the residential schools. Communities were relocated to reserves and sometimes relocated again, and split up by other means, such as replacement of traditional governance. Cultural practices, the next circle, banned or prohibited. connection to nature, the natural world, the next circle, and spirituality being replaced with Christianity, and just banning traditional spiritual practices. Next slide. So I'm just going to give you guys a bunch of metaphors here, and in this case, it's symbols. I think one of the differences, if I have to generalize, is this idea of Western European love of independence versus interdependence, which most other cultures actually value more. Independence is represented, Statue of Liberty, the Declaration of Independence, the rights of the individual, and so on. So very American, very North American, very European. So what Frankl said actually was the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast needs to be balanced with the statue of interdependence on the West Coast. And this is a mock-up of a statue which is actually being constructed in California. I haven't read about it being constructed yet, so I guess they're still working on it. Next slide. Okay, so this is just the way I think, all over the place. But this was, okay, another metaphor that I found. It was a think tank, one of these best of brains things with deputy ministers and so on, and they were doing long-term healthcare planning. And some presentation, I had mentioned it, and Wind Speaker was in the audience, so that was their headline. And having been at the time, consulting psychologist with First Nations Inuit Health, I got into a bit of trouble for this, but I said that all of your language that they were using, drivers and determinants and levers and so on, was very mechanistic and very Western. And so I said that you guys are pushing as if you can push communities into changing their behaviors. But that's sort of that business Western mechanical model. And my argument was we're instinctively pulled towards reasons for living a good and healthy life. And we don't like being pushed. And that just removed the barriers, and we'll get on with the healing business, but the barriers are still there. Next slide. Maybe this, oops, one back. Maybe this illustrates it better. Causes push, reasons pull. And anybody that's been around horses knows you don't do what that woman's doing on the left side. It could be painful. Next slide. Oh, so just a sort of if I were to look at my 35 years of clinical practice and research, I would summarize it into these 5 areas: empowerment, cleansing, balance, discipline, responsibility, connection or belonging, and as 5 biggies in terms of Indigenous healing. Next slide. Just want to mention briefly ceremonies. One of the first name Vanjanep wrote about Rite de Passage, looking at ceremonies around the world. It found they had 3 phases: separation, transition, and incorporation. And when I was writing my dissertation back in '91, I found in examining healing stories of 50 Indigenous peoples, that was one of the things I found was the same sort of stages: separating from the old way of being, transition or transformation, and then reincorporation into the community in your new state. And that, if you look at ceremonies, whether it's Sweat Lodge or Vision Quest or some of the other popular ceremonies, they do follow that pattern. Even going away to treatment, it follows that pattern. We separate from that, our current state of being, undergo this transformation, and then ideally are reincorporated into our community. That's the part that falls down, that we don't plan for and don't do a good job of, is that third part. Next slide. So one more metaphor here, drawing back the arrow in the bow. Next slide. This comes from the Inuit teachings, Inuit Kalyimayatu Kani. I had to write that out phonetically. It's not an easy language to speak. So that this body of knowledge prepares Inuit for success in the future. And elders say that it's like a bow and arrow. If you do not draw back the arrow in the bow, it will drop a short distance in front of you. And so I often use, a colleague of mine talks about the backswing. Next slide. I often talk about this because it's hard for governments to understand with these 2 or 5 year funding windows that the backswing is first necessary before you go forward. Otherwise, it's like playing 18 holes of golf with a putter. You need that backswing because that's where we develop that sense of agency. We gather strength from medicines, review past accomplishments, identify skills and attributes and relationships and resources before we start this healing journey. Next slide. So just to give some general advice, this is some of the things that I've had the opportunity to present to the Canadian Parliament and Senate, these various expert committees that they have. One is that we can avoid a lot of these crises if we shift our energies and resources from intervention and postvention upstream to focus on prevention. Usually you get resources from governments if you declare a crisis, and that's kind of a backwards way of approaching things. Prevention, we need to listen to the real experts, those communities and individuals who have successfully recovered from their own crises. And again, that idea of shifting resources, I think the third point there is we need to help communities in their efforts to reclaim, rediscover, and utilize those natural occurring healing resources, teachings, and practices that work. So my center, I run all my relations research center at my university. That's the idea, is to help people to rediscover, reclaim, and share things that work for healing. And something I've been advocating for years. I don't know if Minister Bennett's in the audience, but we talked about this in 2015, the need for mental health navigators, because the mental health system is really difficult to navigate. Maybe less so in the Yukon because it's smaller, but it can be really tough. So when my partner was director of community services for Kamloops, I convinced her to hire a mental health navigator, and that's worked really well, especially in providing wraparound services. Next slide. So just don't read this, it's too long, but it's as an example of the backswing, finding out what our resources are. I developed this actually for Northern BC First Nations, but then Naho was interested. This is 20 years old now, but uses the concept of the medicine wheel, so balance, that expanding circles, so the connection, continuum of care, and then we looked at past, present, and future resources. So it's a inventory to help communities to find out what resources they have in their community. Next slide. So it's a workbook, and this is one of about 20 pages in it. So this example is looking at past and present prevention resources, and you can see mental, physical, emotional, spiritual, and the expanding circles. So it really gets people to think out of the box, think holistically about what could be a resource. Next slide. Almost done here, I think. Another example how we use this for those concepts of circle and balance and so on with career life planning. These have sold, I think, 75,000 copies in Australia and Canada amongst the Indigenous Human Resources agencies. Next slide. Oh, okay. Last program, one of the courses I teach is Healing from the Land, and my university's had Learning from the Land. So I thought we needed a Healing from the Land, and it's based on over 100 stories that I recorded and analyzed, how people obtain healing from nature, and can be grounding, calming, cleansing, provides us with guidance, perspective, empowerment. So it's a 5-day course. We get on buses in the morning with elders. I co-teach it with local elders and knowledge holders. And the first day is in trees and forests. The next day is rivers, and so on. And it's really practical. People learn ways that they can use, for instance, trees in their healing in forests, and then they practice it, and then we talk about it, and then they practice another activity. So next slide. Yeah, so this one, next slide, was just on the topic of suicide and the idea of asking the real experts. Next slide, please. So categories that facilitate healing and recovery. So I interviewed, in this case, it was 25 Indigenous young adults about their healing journey with suicide. And this is what I came up with. So a lot of this is when they were suicidal in their teens and had obviously recovered. So this is different from those studies you see, I forget what they're called now, where you look at what went wrong. Psychological autopsies, I think they call them. This is what went right. And I think this is the way we need to go, is to ask the people that actually have had success. Next slide. This is the last one, I believe. No, other possible solutions. So peer support. I've always used peer support when I've worked as a counselor at, be it a college or high school or whatever. Training programs. Youth really need to know how to identify and express emotions, how to problem solve, a lot of these things that we're just not teaching them. So communities could develop programs for this. Obviously, unresolved grief and trauma is huge. The Aboriginal Healing Foundation had great programs for this. We have very few now. I think Kwanglen Dunn's got a camp that's doing some of this work, which is great. Video conferencing capabilities. My partner's a psychotherapist, so she's been using Zoom and so on for therapy. So they're working out a lot of bugs for that, but we could be using it to provide support, supervision, consultation for community workers, and even a 24-hour line for workers who could consult, debrief with a senior mental health professional. Very easy to do. Use of ceremony. I just did a project with Kamloops looking at identity ceremonies and how to bring those back and how important they are to youth. And last slide. So back in the late 80s, I was a high school counselor at FH Collins for 3 years and ended up developing this peer support group for prevention for suicide. And the youth came to me and wanted something. And so I didn't know what I was doing. I was a brand new counselor. And so I decided we need to focus on prevention. And because of the group nature of it, it really connected those kids that were disconnected. So some of them were themselves suicidal, others had friends that were, and they just wanted to help. It was community engaged. So it was the high school counselors and teachers and physicians and hospital staff and mental health nurse. So it was a wraparound model. Use the peer support, training, resources, referrals, bridging. It's important that they learn boundaries and their limitations as well. Destigmatize suicide and normalize asking for help. And I think it worked because of the uniqueness of the Yukon. At the time, all the high school students and physicians lived in Whitehorse. And so there was in-person help available 24/7. What I did is I met with all the physicians and the hospital staff and so on. And we worked out a protocol so that if I brought in a student or another peer brought in a student at 2 a.m. to the hospital, they would be kept there overnight. They would be seen by the mental health nurse and psychiatrist, and we'd start that sort of wraparound service. Anyway, the 3 years we ran it, there were no completed suicides in the Yukon, not amongst youth anyways. So we did something right. Anyway, just was pleased to share the little bit that I know. Kwanashis and Nanu Chenchi. Yeah, I don't know if we have any time for questions. I probably used it all. Okay, great. I didn't time it. I just raced through the slides. So
Thank
hopefully
you so
I didn't overwhelm you.
We haven't had any questions come through into the chat, but I thought that your experience providing that peer-led youth suicide intervention was so interesting because of the way that youth do connect with each other and the way that youth do trust each other. So if there was anything else that you wanted to say on that, I thought that was a really neat community intervention that you mentioned.
Well, I mean, I had training in running peer support, and obviously I just finished I think it was my master's at the time. So I had some experience running groups, but I really didn't know what I was doing, other than the fact that I wasn't afraid to address the topic of suicide. And I think at the time, there was a lot of stigma around it, a lot of misunderstanding. And my colleagues, I couldn't get the other counselors or teachers, nobody wanted to touch it. The principal warned me this could backfire. It was a mental health nurse, Jackie, I forget her name. She was my co-facilitator and she was terrific. At the time, I think there was only one mental health nurse and one psychiatrist who left. So teenagers were always giving him a hard time and making up symptoms and so on. They knew he didn't really like teenagers. So I understand now there's a lot of resources, a lot more resources in the Yukon than there was back in the late 80s. What else about it? There were only a few times I ended up taking kids in the middle of the night who were suicidal to the hospital, and the staff were great. A few times kids came to me. There were a couple of attempts. One, I had to take a young fellow who first period, somebody said, hey, his arm's bleeding. I had to take him in for stitches. And there was another attempt. It was actually one of the group members who was put in a youth home outside of town, so he didn't have access to the peer group. And for some reason, they kept a 22 rifle in that group home that wasn't locked. So, I mean, there was an attempt, but then he was cut off from his peers at the time. So anyway, yeah, it worked. And I think there's some teachings in there that could apply, particularly because the Yukon is still quite unique in the fact that it's small, population size wise, and a lot of your resources are located in Whitehorse.
So it sounds like, yeah, some of the teachings that we learned from that was connection is for youth and for everyone, but particularly for youth. And also just to name some of these issues. Just, I think a lot of the stigma maybe still exists, but particularly it's important to say suicide, to talk about suicide frankly, with people who might be struggling with their mental health, and also to provide those connections so that people are able to reach out in a way that doesn't feel like those barriers are there because they don't want to name those things for themselves.
Yeah, and I think the youth had a real ownership in that project, and the fact that all different parts of the community came together to address it, I think it's pretty key. Most of the successful crisis response projects in Canada, Hollow Lake and Nietzsche and so on, it was community members that were coming together and addressing it. And that's what seemed to work quite well.
Wonderful. Well, I feel like I would want to talk to you all day about this, but I am hearing that we're supposed to be wrapping up the session. So yeah. I really appreciate you coming on today to share your knowledge and to really emphasize the role of the community in these important issues. So thank you again for joining us. And thank you everyone who's watching today as well.
Thank you. Bye.